Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have David Stockman with me today to talk about his most recent book titled Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp and the Fantasy of MAGA. Welcome back, David, and thanks for joining me again.
Great. Happy to be with you.
We're talking to you today after President Trump's State of the Union message. And so even though this show won't air until the 19th of February, I'd like to ask you to perhaps just give me your thoughts about Trump's speech last night. I mean, I certainly found a lot of things that I liked to hear. There were other things that made me cringe, but what were your thoughts?
Well, basically, the union that he described as strong and on the verge of, a historic opportunity is not the union that I see. I see a Washington that is out of control, deficits exploding at the very end of a 10-year-old business cycle unheard of. I see Wall Street in a bubble that is exactly what he said in the campaign, one big, fat, ugly bubble, but he's forgotten about that, and he's embraced, the bubble when it got 800 points bigger on the S&P 500 than when he was campaigning. I heard a mixed bag on foreign policy. I voted for Trump. I've supported a lot of things that he has done, and reeling in the American empire is first and foremost among them. I thought America First was a kind of standard that could be established to reorient American foreign policy to defense of the homeland and not policing the entire globe. But unfortunately last night, half of the time he was talking peace and America first, which I applaud heartily, and then half of the time he was talking the same old warfare state rhetoric. The attack on the Iranian nuke deal, I think, is totally misbegotten and misplaced. The cancellation of the INF treaty that Ronald Reagan put into place, for crying out loud, in 1987 was a huge mistake, provocation, unnecessary with Russia. Bragging about attempting to determine who is the proper president of Venezuela, I think, is just more of this kind of neocon interventionism. And it sort of reminded you that when Trump is left to his own devices, he says, forever wars, no more. And he goes back to the White House and he's surrounded by all these people that he's picked for key jobs, Bolton, Pompeo, and you could go on from there, who are neocon interventionists on reconstructed American empire firsters, who are constantly undermining his best impulses. So if you add it all up, you have a Trump fiscal policy that is a disaster. You have his trade wars, which address a real problem, our trade deficits, but go about it in a totally wrong and counterproductive way. You have an obsession with the border and the crisis there, which is entirely concocted, as far as I can tell, by Fox News. And so, therefore, you end up with a mixed bag of circularity and confusion that, in a sense, maybe is understandable and par for the course, because I have said all along in my first book called Trumped, where I predicted he would win the election, and it came out in September 2016, and then in this current one, Peak Trump, that his job is to be the great disruptor, to discredit the status quo and the bipartisan consensus and the indispensable nation empire first foreign policy. And he's to some extent doing that, but by expanding the deficit the way he has, I think it's likely to bring about a financial crisis sometime in the next year or so that will really do the job of discrediting current policy and maybe alerting the country to the fact that we're going in the wrong direction on almost everything, and we need to get back to some basic principles of fiscal rectitude, sound money, free markets, and small government. Trump didn't say a word about any of those principles last night, despite 75 minutes worth of rhetoric and flag waving and bombast and confusing positions on issues.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one of the things that made me cringe was this, all the goodies that he was handing out. Obviously looking for praise and accolades from both sides of the aisle. And I'm thinking, how in the world are we going to pay for this? David, before we get to the how are we going to pay for this topic, it seems to me that from a political point of view, and I think you alluded to this too in one of the interviews I heard from you recently, at the time it seemed to me like he was making a big mistake by not biting the bullet as soon as he came in. As you mentioned, well, when he came into office, we were already 8 years into the credit cycle, essentially. And it was long in the tooth. The stock market, this boom, wasn't much of a boom, frankly, compared to the booms of the past. But we had a long growth period with zero interest rates and all that. And, I mean, he was critical of it when he ran for office, but then hypocritically forgot all about it and cheered low interest rates and started giving the Fed a hard time when they started trying to get back to reality. But why do you think that Larry Kudlow, Steve Mnuchin, some of the economists around him might not have given him the same kind of advice that Ronald Reagan was given during his first term, and that is bite the bullet now, get the hard work out of the way so that when you run for your next term, maybe you're on an uptrend again?
Boy, you've hit the nail right on the head, and that's what I've been talking about. He should have taken a page out of Ronald Reagan's playbook, who inherited a very bad situation, not as bad as the disaster down the road we're facing today, but he never stopped attacking the failed Jimmy Carter economy, the failed Jimmy Carter policies, the mistakes that had been inherited from decades of Democrat policy. And he did that over and over and over. He told Volcker, get the job done, break the back of this inflation. We went through a very nasty and painful recession. Unemployment did go back up to 10%. He was roundly criticized for it, but we got it over in 1982, 1983. The economy started to rebound, and by 1984 it was booming. And then it was safe to say to embrace an economy that had a future, but not, the day you walk in. And unfortunately, Trump has got such an unchained ego, if I can put it that way, that the minute the stock market started going up on the false hope that he was going to turn everything around, he embraced this big, fat, ugly bubble. And so this is why I call it peak Trump, really, because the S&P 500 was at 2140 during the last part of the campaign in 2016. He said it was a big, fat, ugly bubble. He was right then. Then, 2 years later, September 2018, it's now at 2940, up 800 points, and suddenly the big, fat, ugly bubble is a vindication, glowing vindication of how Trumponomics has been such a brilliant success. That was a huge rookie mistake to embrace that bubble, because it has nowhere to go down, and we're in a little rebound here, but this is just I call it the chart monkeys trading chart points, 200-day moving averages, and the rest of it. It's not going to go back to that peak, not next month, not next year, or not for a long time, because we're in huge trouble, and sooner or later the stock market is going to crater in response. So he made a mistake there. The other thing you mentioned I think is really important. People don't get it. The economy doesn't function on presidential terms of 4 years. And if presidents, modestly change policy, it takes months and months and quarters, even years, for the impact to be felt if it's positive, and usually it's not. So therefore, in the first 2 years, to embrace an economy that was at the tail end of a tepid business cycle, again, made no sense and was a huge mistake that he's going to pay for. Specifically, when he was sworn in, we were already in month 90 of this business expansion, the third longest in history. There have only been two longer, the one in the 60s, the guns and butter one, the one in the 90s, the Greenspan tech boom. But this recovery had been a shadow of those prior cycles. GDP in month 90, this time when he was sworn in, was up 13% from the pre-crisis peak way back in 2007. The comparable position in the 60s was the GDP was up about 45%.
Wow.
And in the 90s, at month 90, in the 90 cycle, it was up about 37%. So he was inheriting a very weak, fragile, debt-ridden, savings-parched, distorted economy from the bubble finance on Wall Street at the Fed, and instead of recognizing its fragility and vulnerability to any number of headwinds coming in all directions around the world, he started bragging about an unemployment rate that always comes under 4% in the last few months of even a long business cycle. And I point out in the book, I've got some charts in there that are pretty dramatic, that when the unemployment rate in the end of the 60s, 1960s cycle hit 3.7%, within a year we were in the recession of 1970. When the 1990s cycle, the so-called U3 unemployment rate, which really isn't worth the powder to blow it to hell with, but that's another story. Nevertheless, when it got down to 3.7, 3.8%, we were within a year of the recession that incepted in March 2001. So we're at the tail end of an octogenarian business cycle where there's nowhere for the economy to go but to have its next recession. No one's outlawed recessions. There's a lot of headwinds we can talk about coming around the world and domestically, including this massive deficit. The Fed pivot to QT. Now they're kind of waffling and double-talking the market, but they're still dumping $50 billion of bonds back into the bond pits a month, and that's going to affect supply and demand adversely, which say prices will be pressured down and yields up. All of this is going on, and he spent his time in the State of the Union address bragging about the lowest unemployment rate in 40 years.
Yeah.
Terrible mistake. Besides that, he was elected by flyover America, by the burned-out Rust Belt precincts of, Wisconsin and Iowa, Michigan, western Pennsylvania, Ohio. And the fact is, there's been no boom there. And even the numbers I cited on the general GDP recovery overstate what has actually happened on Main Street. Here's two numbers that I think encapsulate what has happened since 2007 and since the so-called Great Financial Crisis. From the pre-crisis peak, the NASDAQ 100, which is really the leading edge of the tech boom bubble that's underway right now. The NASDAQ 100, even adjusted for inflation, is up 200%. And this isn't from the bottom. This is from the prior peak in October, November 2007. By contrast, industrial production from the prior peak in November 2007 is up 3%. Now, that's 11 years ago. So the recovery is so weak that we've only gained net 3% on industrial production in 11 years when the stock market was gaining 200% in the bubble. So that tells you that this has been a bifurcated recovery, a tremendous artificial Fed-fueled boom on Wall Street, and basically flatlining struggle on Main Street. And the ultimate proof of that, another chart I have in the book, is if you take real median household income from 2007 to the present, it's up 0. And if you take the economy, despite all this ridiculous U3 unemployment rate, it doesn't measure anything because they arbitrarily exclude tens of millions of people from the labor force, and on the one side and on the other side, they count anybody that's got a part-time job at McDonald's for 10 hours a week as employed. Well, so that number isn't worth the powder to blow it to hell with, as I said, but there is one that the BLS publishes that never gets talked up on Bubble Vision or even mentioned, and that is hours worked in the U.S. economy. because when you take hours worked, then that means a guy working in a steel mill overtime 55 hours a week is getting 55 hours of credit. The McDonald's hamburger flipper is getting 10 hours. So when you look at it on an hours basis, which is the right way, in our world today it's all, a gig by the hours economy. Walmart schedules them by their cashiers, let's say, by 15-minute intervals. So if you look at it in hours, total hours utilized by the U.S. economy since the prior peak in late 2007 is up only 6%.
Wow.
Okay? That's a startling number.
That's
6% in 11 years.
That's incredible.
That's not a healthy economy.
No.
That's not anything to brag about.
No.
That is a warning that something is drastically wrong when there's no gain in real household income, 3% creeping forward of the entire industrial economy, including the boom in the shale patch and energy. That's all in the index, and it's still up only 3%.
Yeah.
Ours up 6%, and the stock market up 200%.
Yeah. So it gets to this issue of a redistribution of wealth that is really causing a lot of difficulty sociologically, I think, and politically in our country, David. Obviously, I think you would agree that if we had a sound monetary system, this kind of redistribution of wealth would not be possible. You would agree with that, right?
I agree with it 100%, and that's another thing that I address in the book. So, I appreciate you bringing it up. But as I think a lot of people can understand, this really started, what I call bubble finance, this crazy money printing at the Fed, really got going in a big way when Greenspan stepped in 1987. Within a month of getting the job, we had Black Monday, the stock market down 22%. He panicked, opened up the spigots, sent his minions down to Wall Street and told them you have to keep buying stock and trading with each other whether you want to or not. That's when it all started. But here is a startling fact that tells you all you need to know about this artificial redistribution of income. If you go at that point, the bottom 90% of households in the U.S. owned about 34% of the net worth of the U.S. economy. The top 1% owned 34%. Now, I'm a free market capitalist, so I'm not an egalitarian. I don't think there was anything particularly wrong with that. The 1% more or less get rewarded because they do good things for the economy, and the bottom 90% don't save enough, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the point. If that was kind of a fair measure of outcomes on the free market, because we really hadn't had crazy monetary policy yet, and all this stock market propping and puts and all the rest of it. Here today, here's where we are. The top 1% now have 40% of the net worth. The top 1% have gone from 34 to 40. The bottom 90% have dropped from 34 to 20. Okay, so now we've gone from even Steven 1-to-1 to 2-to-1, and that's not due to any change in tax policy. That's not due to any late-stage failure of capitalist functionality and so forth. That is a direct consequence of bad monetary policy, of what I call the bubble finance, Wall Street-oriented, Wall Street-captivated Federal Reserve that has been running the show with increasing dominance since the late 1980s.
Okay, David, could you help our listeners understand why this cannot continue to go on? I believe you would agree that something drastic has to change. Could we work our way through another bubble, or will this be something that changes perhaps our monetary system, something as drastic as 1971 perhaps? I mean, I'm seeing a lot of foreign nations that are becoming not interested in buying treasuries anymore as they once were. China, for one. I see our European partners are becoming increasingly unhappy about Trump's stance in Iran, for example, and finding ways to defy sanctions that he's trying to force on Europe. I see the Germans aren't happy about Trump trying to stop the pipeline from Russia into Germany. It seems to me that the United States as an empire may be heading into some real trouble. It has its own financial rot that I think could destroy us. How can we afford the military, continuous, endless military expansion, and then not to mention the OACs of this world that think we can have endless bliss and socialism here at home? David, $22 trillion debt right now. means a 1% increase in interest rates adds $220 billion to our expenditures for a year. Aren't we getting close to some sort of a cataclysmic ending of this nonsense that began in earnest in 1971?
Well, I don't know if it's a cataclysm, but it's going to be a totally different world. I think we've pivoted into a long, painful period of, reckoning. And the reason I say that is Trump inherited a $20 trillion debt, and that was bad enough. But then he doubled down. We had this huge tax cut paid for on Uncle Sam's credit card. He took the swamp of waste at the Pentagon at $600 billion and upped it to $720. To get that, he gave the Democrats $60 or $70 billion of domestic pork barrel to get them to vote for his defense, and they then threw in, $100 billion of disaster aid unpaid for by anything.
Yeah.
So the point I'm getting at is the structural deficit he inherited was bad enough. He's now taken it to $1.2 trillion this year, and that's before we get a recession.
Yeah.
When the recession comes, it's going to be $2 trillion. My math laid out carefully in the book is that the inherited plus the Trump overlay will create $20 trillion of new debt in the next 10 years. We'll be at $40 trillion, not $20 trillion. If interest goes up 100 basis points, which it will from where we're headed, that's $400 billion of debt service a year, almost as much, or half as much as the Pentagon budget, and 4 times more than we pay for food stamps. So fiscally, we're heading into a doomsday. We have a doomsday machine unleashed, and we're heading into a disaster. But what's different this time is that even the Keynesians running the central banks of the world have finally realized they can't run these printing presses red hot year in, year out till eternity. And so they have pivoted to QT. And that means the world is totally different. The only reason we got away with the debt growing from $1 trillion when I was at the OMB to $22 trillion today is the Fed was buying the bonds up hand over fist, and doing so forced the other central banks of the world to do the same. In other words, there was a QE convoy of central banks around the world that was balance sheets of $2 trillion in the late 1990s, ended up $25 trillion today. They scooped up $22 trillion worth of basically sovereign debt plus some stock and corporate bonds on the side. And that fundamentally, pushed interest rates lower and bond prices higher. But today we're marching in the opposite direction. They're not buying. There's no net purchase any longer by the central banks of the world in the fixed income market, and the Fed is selling at a $600 billion rate, and I think sooner or later others are going to have to follow, or they're going to have an exchange rate crisis and capital flight and domestic imported inflation and all the rest of it. So this time, and I think this is my final point on this, the central banks of the world painted themselves into such a dire corner that they're desperately now trying to get interest rates up so they have something to cut. They're desperately trying to shrink their balance sheets so they have headroom to rescue the economy again next time around, but it's too late. And so therefore, they're out of dry powder, and when we tip over into recession, and it's happening around the globe already, Germany, you saw the terrible numbers that have been coming out lately, they're in recession. They're just a leading indicator of what's happening in China. And China is kind of the ground zero of the whole artificial global economy. So we're heading into that recession. There's not going to be a quick V-shaped rebound, reflation, like we had last time, because the central banks can't do it. They don't have the dry powder. So what we're going to have is a long L-shaped financial market, depression, and the stock market is going to come back. So this is the time to get out, because there's going to be a 10-year vacation in terms of...
Get out and go where, David?
Well, I think gold's going to go up. Gold is the contra central bank asset. As the central banks of the world become visibly failed, I think on the margin, money is going to seek refuge in the hard asset that the banks, central banks, can't manipulate or destroy.
Is there any chance, when the Jim Cramers of this world, the crybabies that they are, the stock market starts to go down and they just blast Federal Reserve Chairman and demand more money? Do you think that they might, all these central bankers may throw in the towel and opt for something like hyperinflation?
No, I don't think so. I think the central bankers are so Keynesian that they don't understand they've unleashed a monster in the financial system, and once it starts unraveling, they're not going to be able to stop it. Secondly, the numbers, the indicators, the incoming data they look at is all lagging indicators. The unemployment rate and job numbers, which is fabricated by the BLS anyway. So they think they have a strong economy, and they're going to kind of tiptoe around, not wanting to alienate either Wall Street or Washington. But on the other hand, they know that if they can't rescue the economy from the next recession, their mandate to be, the dictators of the financial system will come under severe challenge. So what they're going to do is they're going to keep shrinking the balance sheet. They're going to try to inch up the federal funds rate. Then the economy is going to crater, and they're not going to be able to rescue it.
All right, so I guess we're going to have probably illiquidity, stay out of debt, get out of the stock market, go to cash, go to gold, and hunker down. But
that's exactly right. Well, it sounds, a little discouraging, but actually the idea of capital preservation in the midst of a major economic and financial dislocation is actually a smart thing to do. It's an intelligent thing to do, and it's a profitable thing to do because cash will be king when all of this bubble finally unwinds.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, David, for sharing your time with us again. Best wishes with your book and communicating these very serious issues with the American people. Look forward to seeing you on the boob tube from time to time, and to the extent that you get through to these thick-headed people. Yeah. Thank you so much, and as always, for being with us.